Thank you, Bonnie. First, I want to thank everybody for coming tonight. I know this was rescheduled, but even with the wind out there tonight, it's much, much better than it was a couple of weeks ago when we were supposed to have been here. And I hope none of you were caught out in that blizzard. It took me 3 days to get that 17 inches of snow off of my driveway. So I couldn't have got here anyway, I don't think. But I want to thank Northeast Community College for having us here. Bonnie, of course. And I believe this is part of the Creative Stories class. Mm-hmm. Is that correct?
Yes.
How many of you here are in the Creative Stories class? Good, great. And I see the book in front of you too, so that's even better that that's there. I also want to thank Rhea Weyerhaeuser for being here tonight. It was a little more difficult for her. Rhea is my best friend. She's the editor of my book, and she is my former ballroom dance partner.
I'm on crutches right now, so that's why I'm saying that.
She assures me, though, that that's a temporary situation, so we'll go with that. I want to tell you a little bit about how the Isles of the Forgotten Graveyard came to be. I love history. It's the only subject in school that I liked. I kind of punted on the rest of them. But I'm involved in several different aspects of different cemetery preservation and restoration projects. And through the course of that, I realized pretty quickly that all of our history is in our cemeteries. Under every gravestone there was a story. Some of those stories are far more interesting than others, but everybody has a story. So I started haunting the newspaper archives of various libraries and newspapers, and I started researching some of these stories. I concentrated on ones basically between 1860 and 1910. Stories of people here in Northeast Nebraska. There are so many stories I had to pick which ones to put in this book and put some others off till the next one. But these stories were so interesting, I just felt I had to put them in book form and, in essence, bring these people back to life. These are all historically accurate stories. Now, I wasn't here 100+ years ago, although Rhea tells me I was close to that age. But I didn't know, I wasn't there to hear the conversations between these people. So I had to imagine what those conversations were based on what was happening that day and what was happening in the news with these people. So that's the only part that might not be totally authentic in the book, is the conversations. Those are purely out of my imagination, but I think they're probably pretty close to accurate. One of my favorite characters in this book, a real-life person, was Sheriff Mason DeWitt. Mason DeWitt was a 5-term Dixon County sheriff in the late 1800s. He's actually buried in a private family cemetery northwest of Ponca, Nebraska, about 14 miles. That cemetery bears his name, as well as the name of most of his relatives. And this cemetery is out in the hills. You have to get through it through a pasture and fences. You can't really drive to it. It's not a public cemetery. But it's just a fascinating place to be, and it's one of my favorite places to go out. And you see the deer and the rabbits and the squirrels, even an occasional bald eagle. And to me, that's just fascinating. Now, Sheriff DeWitt, like I said, he was a 5-term Dixon County sheriff. And I really believe that movies should have been made about this guy. His exploits in the history books are just fascinating. I personally think Clint Eastwood would have been a perfect Mason DeWitt in those movies, and I don't know why they didn't make them. Sheriff DeWitt, as I picked this up, is tracking down a murderer in Ponca who murdered a guy for the money that was in his pocket. And he's followed him as far as Sioux City, Iowa. It was mid-afternoon as the sheriff walked into what passed as streets on the riverfront. Mostly they were narrow alleys of dirt between the tents and the shacks. No matter how many times he had been there, it always amazed him how anyone would want to live like this. Ponca would never be considered a spotless town, and DeWitt was used to stepping around things in the streets and the alleys. But Hell's Half Acre, as the riverfront in Sioux City was called then, still took him aback. He walked in and around puddles that smelled of urine and mud, and things he could not and did not want to even identify. Rats feeding on scraps in the alleys looked at him without fear in their dark, blank eyes, and seemingly dared him to approach them. He had no intention of doing so. Even the mongrel dogs that lived in the streets would not approach, preferring to go hungry instead of challenging them for the bits of food. Now, Sheriff DeWitt knew Matt Miller, and so he had the advantage of knowing him by sight. He walked the alleys, looking at the faces of the men sleeping in the shadows, under steps or laying in the streets with only their coats with a bed or a pillow. He sadly noted that amongst them were several women. He knew that some, no matter what their gender, were there by choice. They liked the drink and the company they met in that pursuit, and they were addicted to it. These would forever live and sleep wherever they could find shelter. Others were simply out of money and slept wherever they could until they could move on or up the river. Most of the people who lived in this part of town were not early risers, so it was just starting to come to life. Here and there, a lady that made her living pleasing men in one of the houses of ill fame appeared on the street to empty her chamber pot or in search of breakfast. Even though DeWitt tried to look like he belonged there, the real residents looked right through him and knew he was a lawman. He tried to talk to several of them. One pretended not to see him after tossing the contents of her nightly companion into the street and coming close to splashing him with its contents. Only then did she half-heartedly apologize and disappear back behind her door. Now, I'm not going to go any farther with this story because I know most of you have read it already anyway. But what I tried to do here, I not only wanted to tell the sheriff's story, but I also wanted to recreate the history and what Sioux City, Iowa looked like in 1870. Ultimately, the sheriff takes a riverboat down to Council Bluffs, Iowa, which is a story all in itself. Brings Matt Miller back to Ponca and the faith that was standard for that time of history. I'm going to turn this over to Rhea for a little while.
Can everybody hear me? Okay. I'm going to do this just a little bit different. The book has 6 different stories in it, and I chose the one that's my favorite story. It's kind of a long story, so I condensed it. So I'm going to jump around different pages and give you an idea about it. Now, those of you in the creative writing class, you are aware that there's different ways that you can present a narrator. There's at least, I believe, at least 7 different forms of narration that you can use. This one, the way this is done, this would be almost as if you were eavesdropping on somebody's phone call. I'll try to see if I can do it justice here. The title is A Gentleman Confederate. I have never been as scared in my life as I was during the War of the Rebellion. In looking back, I probably had never been as weak-kneed before then, or since that time either. Once one has seen what I have seen in the war, any other fears pale in comparison, and I have learned to live and love my Lord, my life, my fellow man to its fullest. Please forgive me, as I have not introduced myself. My name is Cummins Gilmer, as was my father before me, and so is my firstborn son. When I was no more than a child, I became a Confederate soldier. I was 18 years and 23 days old when I enlisted on March 27, 1862. That is a date that I'll never forget. There is a gentleman here in my parlor, calls himself a historian, and though I suspect he thinks of himself as an aspiring writer, hoping to sell thousands of books, he doesn't come right out and say that. He wants to know about my life and my experiences during the rebellion and how I ended up here in Yankeedom, far from my birthright. Good morning, young man. Please, come in. Would you join me for a hot mug of coffee? I actually prefer chicory, which I developed a taste for back home in Virginia, but it is hard to obtain here. What I have to offer you is not bad, however, and it is freshly boiled. Please, make yourself comfortable and we can continue our conversation. What was that? How did I enlist? Well, many men who wanted to serve made their way by word of mouth to where regiments were quartered and volunteered. Others made contact with what were called bounty brokers. The bounty brokers were supposed to pay an enlistment bonus of 50 Confederate dollars to each man they could recruit, and many made whatever promises they found necessary in order to deliver. Some were honest, some were not. It was not uncommon for some to promise payment upon reporting for duty, collect their commission, and never pay the promised amount to the man. Of course, by then, the scum was no longer to be seen, and the soldier found himself committed to serve. Did I see battle? Yes, more than I care to recall, much more. But let us talk of that later. If you wish to understand the history, it's important to know of the events that led up to when I met the elephant. Every day we marched, but always came back to camp. One morning, the entire company packed up and left, taking everything with us. We carried upwards of 50 pounds or more on our backs. Our muskets, gunpowder and shot, foodstuffs, water, bedroll, canvas for makeshift tents, and personal items. We moved generally north by northwest towards Kentucky, striding past antebellum plantations with their stately trees and tobacco fields, singing all the way of Dixie and our land of cotton. Little girls, both black and white, some indentured, some aristocrat by birth, would run out and give us flowers or little sacks of cornmeal and hard candy. Young boys would stand proudly and salute. A few would stand tapping on little drums and beg to come along. The older folks would stand solemnly back and watch us pass with sad and knowing expressions on their faces. And we marched all day and made slow time. There is a saying, if you beat a field mule, he won't pull all day long. There is truth to that. We could not march and work all time without any relaxation. Some of it good and some of it bad, depending upon your desires. What do I mean? Well, there was always a camp brew or moonshine for those who wanted it. And I admit, I would enjoy a sip from time to time. What the officers really worried about were the women who followed the camps. They called them hookers. I have always been told, although I don't know it to be true, that they got that name as there were so many of them following Yankee General Joseph Hooker's army that they were named after him. Now, young man, don't look so shocked. It's a fact of life. Where there are a large group of men, there are a certain group of godless women who are willing to provide, well, companionship for pay. There were other things to occupy time. Euchre was played, although I never did understand why it was so popular. My own favorite way of relaxing was with music in our camp. Did you know, young man, that both armies actually recruited musicians? Each company usually had at least a banjo picker, someone who could carry a tune on a harmonica, and of course, a drummer and perhaps a fife blower, or someone who could rattle the bones. No, I could not play a musical instrument, but I could dance a mighty fine jig to the right tune in those days of my youth. But not today, I'm afraid. The old legs are just too tired. Young man, speaking of tired, I am very tired, much so, and wish to stop our conversation for this day. I know you're impatient to hear of the battles, so if you have time to come back in the morning, I may be ready to tell of meeting the elephant. Have a pleasant evening. Son, as long as my Lord permits me to live, I will never forget that date either. It was July 15, 1862. It was hot and sticky, and there was no breeze at all. The trees were still. The flag hung limp from the standard. My uniform was soaking wet and stuck to me like a leech, adding to the uncomfortable feeling I already had. An army does not travel quietly. There are the constant clicks of canteens to belts, the clatter of the officers' horses' hoofs against rocks, and a certain amount of talk and banter amongst the men. As you draw closer to what you believe in your soul is going to be your final hours on earth, the talk stops and the men grow quiet and become somber in thought of home and family. None of us ever smelled good, but now there is a rancid odor of fear, and just as much came from me as the man next to me. Young man, you are so determined to know what it is like to be part of and to live through or even die in battle. Have you ever seen someone die a horrible death? Have you ever killed someone? No? Why then are you so insistent on hearing the details? I assure you that if you had ever been part of such a thing, you would be trying to forget and not being eager to hear about it. But I will tell you about it, and may my Lord forgive me. I can only pray that it is something you nor anyone else will have to experience. To that goal, I will tell you about this day that I met the elephant. Did the Yankees ride elephants? That is funny. No, son. But I am sure that if they had some, they would have tried. The elephant was what we called going to battle. The worry and fear of what was coming was like having the weight of an elephant on your shoulders, a weight that only was lifted by the first fight, but it really never completely went away. It would be said at that time you had met the elephant. The elephant was not just fear of pain and death or the battle itself. It was a combination of anticipation and fear leading up to it. The cramps in the hollow of your stomach, the sweats that were almost like tick fever. Your heart races on and your legs shake. There is no worse sound than hearing a cannonball whistling towards you and not knowing if it will hit you in the head or pass well over you. The cannon spit hot balls and fire and caused the brush to catch fire. And many wounded men died from the flames before they could be tended to. Many balls go whining around us with a strange keening sound, and I heard a solid hit very near me and I knew someone just died. You hear the screams of horrified horses and the curses of their riders as they attempt to control them. A cannonball explodes next to a horse and kills both mount and man. The soldier comes to rest on top of his steed, with their heads side by side. And it struck me that their frozen expressions both looked the same, with teeth bared and wide, horrified, dead eyes. Then suddenly, it is over, and there is silence. That horrible silence. Yes, son, I was captured. Speak up, young man. I don't hear so well anymore. How did I get captured? Well, it just happened. The fight was not going well, and we were retreating through a wet, swampy area, and all of a sudden, I and some others could only see blue uniforms on all sides. Excuse me. Our choices were to put our hands up or be shot. And we all knew the war was lost, so it didn't make any sense to die now. We were tired, cold, hungry, and worn out. Our clothes were basically rags, and what was left of my boots didn't protect my feet anymore. My feet were bleeding and had festering sores that wouldn't heal. There really was no choice for us at that moment, so we laid down our guns and put our hands in the air. I hope I have answered all of your questions and cooled your enthusiasm for war. You have been a polite young man, and I admit I have enjoyed your company. Now, if you don't mind, please show yourself out, as I am suddenly very tired. Good afternoon.
Can you believe that she just got over laryngitis and 2 days ago couldn't say a word? Did pretty good now, though, I think.
Yeah, he enjoyed the quiet. At least that's what he said on Facebook.
I was feeling brave. She couldn't get at me then, I knew. Yeah, I do want to mention a little bit about the research that goes into a book of true stories. And it's always important in something like this to have the facts accurate, because there's always somebody after you print the book that's going to come and correct you on something, and they delight in doing so. So the more research that you can do, the better. There are a lot of places to find information, because the internet is probably the most well-used now. It wasn't always that way. I like to find the old newspaper stories, of course, but there's all sorts of other places. Family histories, small-town anthologies, prison records, county courthouse trial records, and all that stuff is free, and it's available to the public once you figure out how to go find it. I've spent more hours than I can even remember sitting in the Dixon County Courthouse in Ponca, Nebraska, going back through old trial records. They'll just bring out the books, tell them what date and what trial, and they just bring them out and drop them in front of you, and you can just go through them and make all the notes you want. And there's all sorts of information in there. You can find out who the judges were, who the attorneys were, the back and forth in the courtroom itself. It's just fascinating to somebody that really loves history. But this next story I'd like to tell you a little bit about was called "And Then the Train Made an Unscheduled Stop." How many of you know where Bancroft, Nebraska is? Well, good, good. How many of you have been to the Nyhart Center? Oh, that's even better. If you haven't been to the John G. Nyhart Center, you have to go sometime. It's just a fascinating place. And like in our introduction, Ray and I do a lot of living history presentations there. So we'd like to see you there sometime. In 1907, there was a double murder in the Bancroft and Rosalie area. The murderer was a drifter, basically, who did just different odd jobs and then just kept moving along. I'll pick it up from there. The small community of Bancroft, Nebraska has a secret. Maybe not that big of a secret because parts of it are well known, at least the parts that they want you to know. Many small towns have had something happen in their past that they would just as soon everyone forget about. But the people of Bancroft will talk to you about this quite openly, at least as much of it as they know. No one seems to know the complete story, but just the parts of the event that they will tell you about. You see, a number of the townsfolk are related to a vigilante. Some of them are related to more than one vigilante. And most of the people are not really aware of who those other people are. In fact, they're not 100% certain who the vigilantes were, since it happened 100 years ago, although they suspect that they know who some of the relatives are. Today, these people greet each other on the street with pleasantries about the weather, last night's basketball game with Lions, or the latest presentation at the Neihart Center. And then they continue on their way. But as they walk away, you might notice a quick backwards glance and a questioning look. Were his ancestors part of that too? Oh, I'm sure they had to be. I wonder how much he really knows about the part that his forefathers played. Well, it had to be done in any case. Now, Fred Burke was a troubled man. He was troubled in the sense that he was one of those lost souls who had no real purpose in life. He just drifted from town to town doing odd jobs. He worked for a while as a nail clincher in a horse shooting place, and then as a laborer at Standard Oil in Omaha. But with no clear direction in mind of what he was looking for or what would soothe his angst. He had left his mother's home in Colorado and wandered from place to place and finally found himself in northeast Nebraska, not far from the banks of the Missouri River. Fred felt himself fortunate to have found a job as a farmhand on the Koppel family farm that not only paid him, but also supplied him with room and board. And as a bonus, the Koppel family seemed to mostly like him and treated him decently. Now, normally the hired man would sleep in the barn, but he was allowed to sleep in the house and share a bed with their 10-year-old son, Sumner. That still freaks me out. Still, at the end of the day, his bottle and his sense of isolation made him somewhat of an outcast. Others were polite and pleasant in his presence, but none considered him a friend. When several of the men would, as of an evening, spend a few boisterous hours in one of the local taverns, Fred would rarely speak, but morosely concentrate his attention in the bottom of his glass. Now, Fred Burke was not his real name, but for whatever reason buried in his past, he preferred to use it. His Christian name was Loris Ray Higgins. Now, Mr. Higgins murdered Mr. and Mrs. Koppel. It was never really understood why. I don't think he knew why. He went running and he was finally caught. They were fearful that the people of the town would kill him if they got him. So he was kept in a jail in Omaha, Nebraska for his own safety. And he was brought back once for a pretrial hearing and spirited in and out of town before anybody even knew he was there. He was back in his jail cell in Omaha. But he still had to come back for trial. To the law officers in the court, there seems to be no sentiment here other than to let the law take its course. Under the surface, though, emotions are still raw. And small groups of people will all of a sudden become quiet when someone draws near. There are meetings held in private residence by solemn-faced men and whispered conferences on the street. Then early one morning, a phone rings, and when answered, there is heard a short message. The sheep is loaded. The recipient of that call hurriedly makes calls to others, and they to even more. The Northwestern train from Omaha that morning of September 4th, 1907, was not scheduled to stop in Bancroft on its way to Pender. It stopped in Fremont, and was supposed to go right through Bancroft before stopping in Pender. But this particular morning, at approximately 8:37, the train was stopped at the Bancroft Depot by 20 to 25 masked men. All were wearing almost identical overalls, hats, and had masks made from white flour sacks to cover their features. All, of course, were armed. The vigilantes boarded the train and were met by Sheriff Young and a deputy. Sheriff Young offered no forcible resistance. The deputy had a revolver in his hand and when told to put it away, refused and was knocked to the floor and told not to be foolish. The engine was disconnected from the rest of the train and sent down the tracks. Some of the passengers thought they were being robbed and offered up their valuables. Now these masked men, they placed a rope around the neck of Horace Ray Higgins and led him to the station platform and then placed him in a dray wagon. The wagon was driven about a mile from town to the railroad bridge over the Logan Creek. None of the mob had anything to say to him, and he was not assaulted. The rope was tied to the highest beam of the bridge, and Higgins was asked if he had anything to say. He tried to atone for his wanton acts, but had no excuse to offer, and he had not reason for committing them. He also avowed his faith in the religion he had found through the help of the good women in Omaha who had come to his cell and prayed with him. But as soon as he made his brief statement, the mob unceremoniously picked him up, threw him over the railing of the bridge, and Higgins reached the end of his rope with a terrible bounce, snapping his neck and producing his instant death. Now, Higgins was a tall beanpole of a man in life. Hanging dead, stretched out from the rope, seemed to add extra inches to his already long frame. To make sure that he was indeed dead, the vigilantes used his body hanging only about a foot from the water as target practice, shooting him an estimated 40 times. This all took place with little emotion, little excitement, and was over before most of the Bancroft townsfolk even knew what was happening. As soon as it was done, the mob made their way into the trees, where they removed their matching overalls, hats, and masks, throwing them in a pile to be forever abandoned and scattered in all directions. No one ever talked about the matter, except possibly to their own families. No one ever bragged about it. No one ever discussed it in public. No one ever professed to know a single man who participated. It is exceedingly unlikely that any of the names of the mob will ever be known, and the general opinion of the public was that it was something that had to be done and best to be left alone. So far as Sheriff Young is concerned, he does not appear to know who any of them were. Now, I mentioned that how important research is in some of these things. That day in Bancroft, there happened to be a photographer there. His name is not known, but he snapped some pictures. In 1966, Life magazine put out a special double issue, an anniversary issue, on photography. 2 of those pictures ended up in this magazine. And I realize you can't see them from where you are, but I'm going to leave this up here when we're done, and you're more than welcome to come up and look at these photos. This one on the left is a photograph of all the vigilantes on the dock at the Bancroft Railroad Station, waiting for that train to arrive. The one over here is a photograph of Loris Ray Higgins hanging from that railroad bridge. And this is the kind of stuff that makes history interesting for me. And once you start looking for things, you run across something, and that sends you somewhere else, and that sends you somewhere else again. And it's just like a snowball rolling downhill. Before you know it, you've got enough material to write 100 books if you had the time to do it. So that's what makes this interesting for me. I hope you enjoyed that. I'm going to turn this back over to Rhea again.
I'm going to tell you about a young woman who was born in central Nebraska. And again, this story is written in a totally different way. What Brad did with this one is he took a lot of the excerpts right out of the newspaper. And this took place back in the 1800s. So this is exactly how it was written. So nothing was corrected in here, nothing was edited. The spelling is the way that it was in the newspapers and the articles. Now, what I did is, again, I condensed this story into a short version to give you a little bit of an idea. So I'll kind of bounce around a little bit in here. This story is titled, What Happened, Hazel? I'm going to start with the prologue. There is a small and mostly forgotten cemetery in Dakota County, Nebraska, near the village of Waterbury. The cemetery was abandoned in the early 1900s. When the church disbanded, some of the buried were exhumed and re-entered into other cemeteries, leaving only the old tombstones and memories. With them went the records of those who were still buried there. For many years, the cemetery, which has been known both as Old Log Church Cemetery or Elk Valley Cemetery, was overgrown with brush and weeds and visited mostly only by the hunters searching for pheasant or deer in the thick, dense brush. This cemetery is undergoing restoration and grudgingly revealing its secrets. In the Minter family plot towards the southeast corner of the cemetery is a small stone marker carved simply with the initials O.M. This marks the grave of Ora Minter, also known as Hazel Hammond. This is out of the Sioux City Journal, August 25th, 1895. At 3 o'clock this morning, a man and a woman were shot in a house of prostitution over 209 4th Street. The man is dead, and the woman probably will die. The young woman, whose name is Hazel Hammond, is about 18 years old. The man, as you know, already died. His name was Max Nowak. Crowds visit the undertakers. Hundreds of curious people visited Millard's undertaking rooms yesterday to view the remains of the dead man. The morgue resembled a museum at times. The corpse lay stretched out on the embalming table, and the people, some of whom were women, inspected the fatal wound and discussed the man's general appearance. After a good look at the remains, the people would look at his clothes, which were lying on a nearby table, with genuine interest. They also inspected the property found on his person when searched. This consisted of a box of cigarettes, a 25-cent piece, a penny handkerchief, and other trinkets. After this, they would advance theories of the crime, some of which were ludicrous. All day people came and went, and it seemed that the whole town had been there when the doors of the morgue closed in the evening. The appearance of the body in the morgue was sickening. Blood had settled around the wound in the temple, as well as about the upper extremities of the body. Sioux City Journal, August 27, 1895. Hazel Hammond, alias Ora Minter, the girl who was shot at 209 4th Street in the tragedy of Sunday morning, died at the Samaritan Hospital at 12:45 p.m. yesterday. The unfortunate girl never regained consciousness for a moment after the fatal morning and died with the secret of the tragedy locked in her bosom. She succumbed peacefully, without the one she loved in other days about her bedside. None but strangers, attending physicians and nurses, witnessed the sad moment. Early in the day, the doctors knew the girl could not survive, although every effort known in the medical fraternity was tried in the hope that life might be sustained, at least long enough for the girl to regain consciousness and tell the story. The girl's father, William Minter of Central City, Nebraska, did not arrive in time to see his daughter alive. The remains were removed to Millard's undertaking rooms and placed in the morgue. Now, I'm going to jump about 5 years forward here, and then I'll come back to Hazel. The inquest was taking place, and so many people had their different theories, their opinions, their thoughts of what might have happened. Why are these two people dead? Many people were questioned. Some were arrested and released. But finally, 5 years later, they had suspects. This is in the Waterloo Semi-Weekly Courier, Tuesday, July 24th, the year 1900. Gallagher and Chapin had been arrested in Omaha for other charges, and they were sentenced to 15 years. Well, the Sioux City police were hoping they could get their hands on them. John McGraw, alias Jack Gallagher, alias Kid Gallagher, who knew Alex Chapin, is believed to have murdered Max Nowak and Ora Minter in Sioux City early Sunday morning, August 25th, 1895, at Maud Hoyle's house of ill fame. He will never have to stand trial for that foul crime. The officers of the law in Sioux City, who have been watching for 5 years for a chance to secure possession of him, are frustrated, and the gallows are cheated. The evidence which would have been introduced against him and which are now being held for Chapin is very strong. Gallagher is dead at the Nebraska State Prison at Lincoln, and he will be buried in the penitentiary graveyard under the number 2849. The case of Gallagher had been puzzling the prison physician for 6 months, but it's a puzzle no longer. His death is the result of a half-insane desire to secure freedom in the most curious and unusual way. Some 6 months ago, he first sought the aid of the prison physician, complaining of feeling bad about the stomach and kidneys. The doctor failed to recognize the symptoms, but he prescribed medications in spite of which Gallagher steadily grew worse. Dr. Edwards' suspicions were aroused, and he had Gallagher closely watched. Finally, the truth was learned. The convict had been eating plastering scraped off the wall, drinking great quantities of vinegar on the sly, and swallowing pellets of soap wrapped in tissue paper. His object was to puzzle the doctors and get weaker and weaker until the governor would pardon him as a dying man. But he played his trick too long. Now I'm going back to Hazel. The remains of Ora Minter shipped for burial. Now this goes back 5 years back. Yesterday afternoon, the remains of Ora Minter were taken from the slab on which they had been resting in the morgue. Dressed and put in a black cloth-covered casket. On the lids were the words, "At rest." In the morning, a number of women of the town who had known the girl during her lifetime did what they could as a tribute to the memory of an unfortunate member of their class. They curled her hair and put her in a shroud and performed all the services which were necessary upon such an occasion. When the casket was prepared, it was taken to the shipping room. Here the glass top was left uncovered and the remains viewed by hundreds of people of all classes. On the coffin, a bunch of American beauties were placed. Attached to them was a piece of paper bearing the names: May Burke, Eunice Byrne, Myrtle Steeder, Cleo Perry, and the word sympathy. Shortly after 6 o'clock, the casket was packed and taken to the Short Line Depot for shipment to Waterbury, Dakota County. The girl will be buried alongside other relatives. Now you may be wondering how I know how they did that, how they curled her hair, what they did. I know because a long time ago, I was one of those girls. I was one of those girls.
Oh, okay. Well. You know, something that we found out, it didn't really start with this book. We were actually doing it, well, the book was still in its works, I guess, but we discovered that, much to our own amazement, we had somewhat of a knack for putting on living history plays beyond the grave, historically correct presentations. And neither one of us can still quite believe that we do this, but we've gotten kind of good at it, actually. We do a variety of different ones. We do Jesse James, if you can picture me as Jesse James, but the most amazing part of that is I do it with my mother, Zerelda.
I play his mother in that part.
Pretty well, too, I might add. And we do others. We do different ones about some of the historical pioneers in the area. I've done a couple of special ones for local groups, like when Wakefield had a big celebration on the 4th of July. They wanted someone to play one of the original founders, and I got roped into that, and actually I kind of like doing that one. And Rhea does one that's just amazing to see, although it might be a little difficult in present condition. But she does a Women's Christian Temperance Union member named Clementine Sullivan. And I got to tell you, when she gets going up there on the stage with a Bible in one hand and a hatchet in the other, you want to stay out of her way because she does break things. I mean, she breaks things. She's actually going to do this Wednesday night on 13th in Creighton, Nebraska for the Lutheran Church Women's Association. Unfortunately, that's a closed group. It's just being for them. Right? I'd invite you all to come and see it because it's a lot of fun. But we do a lot of different things like this, and we got to get our own little promotion going here a little bit. You know, we've got business cards up here and everything. If anybody's interested in doing that kind of thing, and you can chime in anytime you want to if you got something to say. But
I'll chime in right now. I always have something to say.
Except 2 days ago, she didn't.
I have had laryngitis for about 5 days, and I'm really happy that I can talk now. Another fun one that I've done, we do some things for the senior center up in Sioux City a lot too. And we do the Allen Museum and that. But one of them that I did for the senior center in Sioux City, I don't know if anybody here is at all familiar with, around Sioux City, actually it's on the Nebraska side, it's called Lottie's Grave. Has anyone heard of that? No. I've portrayed Lottie, and I told her side of the story along with what everybody else was saying too. So I did present both sides of that, but that was kind of a fun one to do also, and I'm hoping to do that one again sometime. But go ahead, Brett.
You know, somebody out here, I heard them say yes, they had heard of Lottie's grave. Who said that? Really? Are you from up in that part of the country?
I lived in Sioux City for like 3 years.
And where?
I was living in Sioux City right after high school for a while.
Oh, okay. So, I'm going to quickly tell you part of that story.
Did you ever go to Lottie's grave?
No, I chickened out when I was supposed to go.
Oh.
We've gone up there.
The story was that there was this old lady that was kind of a witch, supposedly, and then when she died, she
A part that Brad thought I would play real well, by the way.
And she did. But when she died, she was buried in a cemetery near Homer in the Taylor Cemetery. And the grave is supposed to be haunted. There's supposed to be no grass that grows on it and all that type of thing. So kids used to go up there. Back in the day, they'd get a few beers, maybe they still do, and they'd go up and they'd visit the grave and they'd try to scare each other. That's basically what happened. But the truth was, the entire story was completely made up. The high school class in South Sioux City, it was an arts class, I guess, or maybe it was a creative stories class. It sounds appropriate. They were given a project to create a video. And they went up to that cemetery and they picked a stone at random. It was Lottie's stone. And they created this whole fictional story and video about this witch that was buried in that cemetery. And it was all completely, totally made up. But I heard the story when I was in high school, and that's a long, long time ago. But it's just been kind of a tradition
Really
for
long time
everybody
ago.
to go up there. So, but it's totally, completely made up, but it just makes a fascinating story. We were telling this to a group at the Dakota City Library here a while back. And we told, because they all knew the story there, because they're right there in the area. And we were telling them about that. And the librarian was sitting in the back of the room. And all of a sudden she stands up and she waves her arms and says, "I was part of that class. I worked on that video." So it was all fake. But it was a lot of fun doing those kind of things. So, does anybody have any questions for us about the book or the living history presentations or anything whatsoever? You know, we have groupies. Can you believe that? We have groupies.
Two.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that. But They've seen several of our presentations, and he told me earlier that when they found out we were going to be here tonight, they decided they were going to come. So we now have groupies. I think that's just fascinating.
Now, one of the things too, those of you who are in the creative writing class, you've already probably read the book, and you can tell by the 6 different stories, there's several different styles of writing in there. So that's kind of pretty cool about that. I like 6 different stories in there. And everybody has their favorite story. But anybody in here have a favorite story out of there that they like? You have a favorite yet, or?
What's that? You say I haven't read it yet? Is that what you said?
No, Blood in the Fields, the first one.
Blood in the
Blood in the
Fields?
Fields. Cool. That's my favorite one too. I play him at some of these living history things, so it's kind of fun.
Are they going to have the Mars birthday this year?
Dick is hemming and hawing around about that, but it sounds like he's not going to have it until the 200th birthday party. A friend of ours,
Possibly.
yeah, a friend of ours in Mars, Nebraska. Yes, there is a Mars, Nebraska. It's just a few miles from Venus, Nebraska. His great-great-grandfather started that town, and he still lives out there. So every year he would have a birthday party for his great-great-grandfather, and it got to be quite something. He'd have the 193rd birthday party, 194th, 195th, but it got to be a little too much, so he's going to wait, it sounds like, until the 200th birthday party. So it's going to be another 4 or 5 years, probably.
That's why we're groupies.
That's what they're groupies from that.
Heard you and know about it.
Oh, yeah, yeah, probably so. And thank you for coming, I appreciate it. Oh, come on, you're not all that bashful, are you?
Any questions at all about anything?
How she hurt her foot? Anything?
Actually, it's the Liz Frank injury, which some of you might know if you're athletes. I was going for a layup, and okay, I fell over the kitchen chair, but anyway.
I have a question for you, Red.
Okay, Lynn.
The Shapen that you mentioned in the book, how do you spell that? The character, we were reading the story about somebody named Shapen. How's that spelled?
Was that in the last story?
I think it's C-H-A-P-I-N.
C-H-A-P-I-N.
There's, I live in Shapen Township, and there's a whole story about the Shapen family. And
Oh, wow.
I just wonder if it's a connection.
Very well could be.
I'll have to talk to you about that later.
Okay.
Anything else, anybody?
If not, going once? Going twice?
Oh, and if anybody does not have a book and would like to buy one, Brad does have some up here.
How could I forget that?
Because you often do.
I often do, yes. We'll turn this back over to Bonnie.
Thank you.
All right, first things first, make sure and turn those cell phones back on so you don't miss some important